The conference room was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but oppressive, like the breath had been sucked out of the entire floor. I stood at the edge of the room, notebook in hand, seconds after the moment that would change everything. Greg Whitmore, the man who'd been my boss for nearly 7 years, the same man I'd stayed late for, covered for, and kept afloat through 2 mergers, stood at the front of the room with a cruel smile on his face. "This company has no room for dead weight," he said, looking directly at me. "We're tightening up, and frankly, Claire, I don't know what you even do anymore." I couldn't move. The faces of 40 colleagues turned toward me in unison, a sea of uncomfortable expressions ranging from pity to thinly veiled satisfaction. The quarterly meeting had started like any other. Budget projections, client acquisition updates, the usual corporate fanfare. I'd prepared all the operational reports as always, placing them neatly in Greg's inbox 3 days prior, with bullet points highlighted just how he liked them. His voice pierced again, louder this time, for everyone to hear. "Claire Bennett, your position is now obsolete. You'll receive no severance, no benefits, and your access ends at noon. Consider yourself cut off." A nervous laugh rippled through the room. Most people stared at their laptops, pretending to take notes. No one looked me in the eye. Not even Marlene, the young woman I'd personally mentored from intern to marketing associate over the past year. 7 years. That's how long I'd given to Pinnacle. Solutions. 7 years of birthdays missed, of dinner plans canceled, of "sorry, something came up at work" texts to friends who eventually stopped inviting me altogether. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Greg asked, eyebrows raised, enjoying this public execution. The room waited. I felt the weight of 40 sets of eyes. In that moment, 1,000 responses flooded my mind. I could list every crisis I'd averted, every late night I'd worked, every impossible deadline I'd somehow met. I could mention how I single-handedly rebuilt our vendor management system after the last IT director quit without notice. I could remind everyone that I was the one who implemented the workflow automation that saved the company nearly $200,000 last year alone. But I didn't. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said quietly, closing my notebook. I gathered my few personal items from the table. A pen my mother had given me before she passed, a small notebook, my coffee mug. Greg looked almost disappointed by my composure. He'd wanted tears, maybe pleading, something to validate his decision in front of everyone. "That's it?" he asked. "After all this time?" I looked at him, really looked at him, his expensive suit, his perfectly coiffed hair, the Rolex watch I knew the company had paid for as a performance bonus last Christmas. "Yes," I said. "That's it." I walked out, back straight, eyes forward. The door closed behind me with a soft click. In the elevator, I finally exhaled. My hands were shaking, but not from fear or sadness. It was something else. A strange, unfamiliar feeling, bubbling up inside me. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was relief. The building's lobby was bustling with the usual mid-morning activity. People rushing in with coffee cups, delivery personnel dropping off packages, the security guard, Ron, nodding at familiar faces. I'd greeted Ron every morning for 7 years. Today, he looked concerned. "Everything okay, Ms. Bennett?" he asked, noticing the small box of belongings in my arms. "Just a change of direction, Ron," I said, managing a smile. "Take care of yourself." Outside, Chicago's spring air hit my face. It was April, but winter was still hanging on, reluctant to release its grip on the city. The wind whipped between the skyscrapers, carrying scraps of paper and the faint smell of the river. I stood there, suddenly unsure where to go. For 7 years, my days had been structured around Pinnacle's needs. Now, at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning, I had nowhere to be. My apartment was only 15 blocks away, but I decided to walk rather than take the L train. I needed to think, to process what had just happened. As I walked, my phone started buzzing. First, it was HR, probably calling to formalize my termination. Then Marlene. Then Jaden from IT. I silenced it and kept walking. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that over the past 2 years, I had gradually become the silent backbone of Pinnacle's entire operational infrastructure. It wasn't planned that way. It just happened, one small crisis at a time. When the payroll system crashed last year, I was the one who stayed until 3 a.m. to restore the backup and ensure everyone got paid on time. When our biggest client threatened to leave after a miscommunication, I was the one who smoothed things over, creating a new communication protocol that Greg later presented as his own innovation. I'd designed workarounds for our outdated software, created training manuals no one knew existed, and built relationships with vendors who gave us preferential pricing, simply because I remembered their children's names and sent holiday cards. I wasn't just an operations manager. I was the invisible thread holding the entire tapestry together. And now, that thread had been cut. My apartment felt foreign in the middle of a workday. The sunlight came through the windows at an unfamiliar angle, illuminating dust particles I'd never noticed before. I set my box down on the kitchen counter and stared at its meager contents. 7 years reduced to a mug, a few photographs, a plant that had somehow survived on minimal attention. I made tea, a luxury I rarely afforded myself during workdays, and sat by the window overlooking the neighborhood. Cars passed below. People walked their dogs. A mail carrier delivered packages. Life continuing as normal while mine had just been upended. My phone had finally stopped buzzing. 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, all from Pinnacle employees. None from Greg. I turned it off completely and watched the steam rise from my cup. For the first time in years, I had nothing urgent to do. No fires to put out, no expectations to meet. What they didn't know, not yet, was that in exactly 6 days, Greg would show up at my apartment door, desperate, ashamed, and begging me to fix the very mess he created. Because I wasn't just a parasite, I was the only reason the company hadn't collapsed months ago. And now, I was gone. That first night was strange. I woke up at 2:13 a.m., heart racing, convinced I'd forgotten to send an important email or follow up on a client request. It took several disorienting moments to remember. I didn't have a job to wake up for. The next morning, I allowed myself the novel experience of breakfast without multitasking. No laptop open, no conference calls, no rapid-fire emails being composed between bites of toast. Just me, a properly cooked omelet, and the sounds of my neighborhood coming to life outside. My phone remained off. I wasn't ready to face the aftermath, yet wasn't prepared to hear colleagues' awkward condolences, or worse, their silence. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went for a walk with no destination in mind. The Chicago River Walk was peaceful on a weekday morning. A few tourists snapped photos, joggers weaved around slower pedestrians, water taxis ferried small groups of passengers. I found a bench facing the water and sat, watching the ripples catch sunlight. It was there that the memories started flooding back, no longer held at bay by the constant demands of work. I remembered my first day at Pinnacle. Eager, nervous, fresh out of community college with an associate's degree in business administration. My mother had been so proud. "Claire," she'd said, "you've always been the smartest one in the room. They're lucky to have you." 3 months later, she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. 6 months after that, she was gone. Greg had seemed understanding at first. "Take all the time you need," he'd said. But the unspoken corporate expectation was clear. Grief had a deadline. I returned to work after 1 week of bereavement leave, throwing myself into my assistant role to escape the emptiness of my apartment. That year, I worked harder than anyone. Came in earlier, stayed later. When the operations coordinator position opened up, Greg gave me a chance. "You've earned it," he said. The praise felt like oxygen then. The promotion came with more responsibility but barely any increase in pay. "We'll revisit your compensation after you've proven yourself in the role," Greg promised. We never did. Still, I excelled. Created new filing systems, streamlined vendor payments, reorganized the supply chain to reduce waste. Small, invisible improvements that accumulated over time. Greg took credit for most of them during executive meetings. I didn't mind then. I was just happy to contribute. When COVID hit in 2020, Pinnacle, like many companies, struggled. The first round of layoffs took out nearly a third of our workforce. Suddenly, I found myself doing 3 people's jobs: operations, some accounting, and parts of HR. The nights grew longer, the stress heavier. But I persisted, partly out of fear of losing my job, partly out of genuine concern for the company I'd helped build. "We're all making sacrifices," Greg said during a Zoom meeting, speaking from his lake house while the rest of us worked from cramped apartments. "But we're family and we'll get through this together." Family. The word echoed hollowly even then. When we finally returned to the office in 2021, Greg hired his niece Heather as the new marketing director, despite her complete lack of experience. I was asked to show her the ropes. Translated, do her job while she took the credit. And I did, because that's what I always did. Made things work, solved problems, kept the wheels turning. Last year, when our software system crashed the night before a major client presentation, I stayed until dawn, manually reconstructing the data and presentation slides. Greg waltzed in at 9 a.m., presented flawlessly, and secured a $2 million contract. At the celebration lunch, he thanked the team without making eye contact with me once. A boat horn pulled me from my memories. I realized I'd been sitting on the bench for over 2 hours, lost in the past. The sun had shifted, warming my face. A group of school children on a field trip passed by. Their excited chatter a welcome interruption to my thoughts. I decided to turn my phone back on. The notification sounds were immediate and overwhelming. More calls, more texts, several emails marked urgent. Most surprising were the multiple voicemails from Jaden in IT. Jaden rarely spoke to anyone, preferring to communicate exclusively through terse emails and messaging apps. I listened to his message first. Claire, it's Jaden. Look, I don't know what happened in that meeting, but things are already falling apart here. The vendor management system is asking for an authentication password no one seems to have, and the automated payment schedule for Norton Media is triggered to go out tomorrow, but no one can find the approval documentation. Call me back, please. There were similar messages from others. The accounting team couldn't access certain files. HR needed the updated compliance checklist for the quarterly audit. Marketing couldn't find the assets for the campaign scheduled to launch next week. I felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication certainly, but also genuine concern for my former colleagues. Most of them weren't bad people. They were just trapped in the same toxic system I'd been freed from. The last message was from Marlene, her voice small and apologetic. Claire, I'm so sorry about what happened. I wanted to say something, but I froze. Greg blindsided everyone. No one knew he was going to do that. Things are kind of chaotic here now. If you could just let us know where to find the Q2 projection spreadsheets, that would be really helpful. And, I miss you already. I closed my eyes, considering my options. I could help them, send the passwords, explain the systems, guide them through the processes I'd built and maintained for years. It would be the kind thing to do. Or I could let them figure it out on their own. I put my phone back in my pocket, decision unmade, and continued my walk. For the first time in 7 years, someone else's emergency wasn't immediately my emergency. It was a strange feeling, part guilt, part liberation. That evening, I cooked a proper dinner. Not a microwave meal eaten while answering emails, but an actual recipe from the cookbook my mother had given me years ago. As I chopped vegetables and measured spices, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The shape of a future I might actually want, rather than one I merely endured. The sun was setting when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Marlene, still in her work clothes, looking nervous. I opened the door. I'm sorry to just show up, she said quickly. But no one at the office would tell me where you live, so I had to check the emergency contact information in the HR files, which I know is totally inappropriate, but... Marlene, I interrupted gently. Why are you here? She looked at me, eyes wide and earnest. Because it's not right, what Greg did to you, and because everything's falling apart without you. But mostly because I should have said something during that meeting, and I didn't. And I'm really, really sorry. I studied her face. Young, anxious, sincere. In her, I saw a reflection of myself from years ago, before I'd learned to silence my own voice. Would you like to come in? I asked. She nodded gratefully. As I closed the door behind her, I didn't yet know that this unexpected visit would be the first domino in a sequence of events that would change everything. For me, for Pinnacle, and especially for Greg Whitmore. Marlene sat perched on the edge of my couch, cradling a mug of tea I'd offered her. My apartment felt strange with a visitor from Pinnacle inside it, as if two separate worlds were colliding. I've never seen it like this before, she said, staring into her mug. People are panicking. It's like someone cut the power to half the building but expected everything to keep running. I nodded but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. The vendor management system locked everyone out this morning. Finance can't process. Payments. The client database is asking for authorization codes no one has. She looked up at me. Greg spent 3 hours on the phone with tech support, but they couldn't help because apparently it's a custom configuration that wasn't in their standard documentation. A custom configuration I had built myself, working weekends for 2 months straight. Greg had refused to pay for the premium vendor support package, insisting we could make do with the basic version. So I'd rebuilt half the system's architecture to make it work for our specific needs. And the Norton Media campaign? I asked, knowing it was scheduled to launch on Friday. Millions in potential revenue hung in the balance. Marlene's expression told me everything. The assets are missing. The approval documentation, too. Greg saying you must have deleted them on your way out. That stung. I'd never sabotaged anything in my life. They're not missing. They're in the secure archive folder. It's company policy for all final approvals to be stored there. What secure archive folder? I sighed. The one I created last year after the compliance audit. I sent an email about it to the entire team. It's password. Protected. Standard procedure for legally sensitive documents. No one remembers that email, Marlene said. Or the password. Of course they didn't. No one ever read my process emails. They just expected me to handle everything. It's Pinnacle Secure 2023 with the exclamation point, I said. The username is archive admin. Marlene quickly typed this into her phone. Thank you, she whispered. Then looking up. Claire, why didn't you ever say anything? About all the systems you were managing, all the extra work? The question hung in the air between us. Why hadn't I? The answer wasn't simple. At first, it was because I wanted to prove myself, I said slowly, thinking it through as I spoke. Then it became habit. And eventually, I guess I was afraid. Afraid of what? That if I drew attention to how much I was actually doing, they'd either expect even more or decide they needed someone with fancier credentials to do it. I smiled ruefully. I never finished my bachelor's degree, you know. Just the associates from community college. Greg reminded me of that every time I asked for a raise. Marlene's eyes widened. But that's ridiculous. You basically ran the company's operations single-handedly. Not on paper. On paper, I was just an operations coordinator who helped out with various tasks. I shrugged. Corporate America runs on paper. We sat in silence for a moment, the truth of the situation settling between us. They're having an emergency meeting tomorrow, Marlene finally said, to address the operational challenges. That's how Greg phrased it in the email. I couldn't help but laugh. Operational challenges. Nice euphemism for, we fired the only person who knew how everything worked. Marlene didn't join my laughter. Instead, she looked at me with unexpected intensity. You should come to the meeting. What? No. Just show up. Walk in and watch their faces. Show them you know exactly what's happening. The idea was tempting, dramatically so, but also terrifying. And then what? Greg publicly humiliated me. He called me a parasite. He's not going to admit he was wrong. Maybe not, Marlene agreed. But everyone else would see the truth. And isn't that worth something? Was it? I wasn't sure anymore. For years, I'd believed that silent competence would eventually be recognized and rewarded. That hard work spoke for itself. That belief had led me nowhere. I'll think about it, I said, knowing I probably wouldn't go. After Marlene left, I sat alone in my living room, turning our conversation over in my mind. My phone buzzed with a text from her. Access granted to archive. You just saved the Norton launch. Thank you. Something shifted inside me then. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. More like clarity. I'd spent years making myself smaller, less visible, less threatening. Accepting whatever scraps of recognition fell my way. Believing that someday, someone would notice all I'd contributed. But what if that someday never came? What if, instead of waiting to be seen, I needed to make myself impossible to ignore? I picked up my phone and began composing an email. Not to Greg or anyone at Pinnacle, but to myself. A comprehensive list of every system I'd built, every process I'd improved, every crisis I'd averted. Dates, details, measurable outcomes. By the time I finished, it was past midnight, and the document was 17 pages long. I stared at it, somewhat shocked. This was my true resume. Not the sanitized single page I'd been updating for years, but the real record of my contributions. I'd never seen it all laid out like this before. It was impressive. For the first time since being fired, I felt a flicker of something new. Not just anger or hurt, but a strange, unfamiliar sense of my own worth. I slept deeply that night, without waking once to check my phone. The next morning, my email inbox had exploded. Jaden from IT wanted to know about server backup protocols. Accounting needed password resets for 3 different systems. The client relations team couldn't find the contact history for Westbrook Industries. I read each message but didn't reply. Instead, I did something I'd been putting off for years. I updated my LinkedIn profile. Not with the sanitized version of my work history, but with the real one. Projects managed, systems built, results achieved. By noon, I had 3 connection requests from recruiters. My doorbell rang around 2 o'clock. I expected Marlene again, perhaps with more questions or news from the emergency meeting. Instead, I opened the door to find Heather, Greg's niece. She looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot in her designer heels. "Claire," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Uncle Greg, Mr. Whitmore, sent me to talk to you." I leaned against the doorframe, not inviting her in. "Did he?" "There are some issues at the office, time-sensitive issues. Mr. Whitmore thought perhaps you could clarify a few processes for us." Her tone was carefully professional, but I could hear the desperation underneath. Why didn't he come himself? Heather's composure cracked slightly. "He's on a conference call with Norton Media. They're threatening to pull their account if we don't deliver the campaign assets by end of day." I considered this. Norton was our biggest client. Losing them would be catastrophic for Pinnacle. "And what exactly do you need from me?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Just information, passwords, file locations, workflow instructions." She attempted a smile. That didn't reach her eyes. "We'd compensate you for your time, of course. As a consultant." A consultant. 3 days ago, I was a parasite. Now I was a consultant. "What's the rate?" I asked. Heather looked startled. I'd have to check with accounting, but I'm sure we could offer you a fair—" "My consulting rate is $200 an hour," I interrupted. 4-hour minimum, payment upfront. Her eyes widened. I don't have the authority to approve that." "Then I suggest you find someone who does," I said calmly. "Or perhaps you can figure it out yourselves. After all, according to Greg, my position was obsolete." Heather's professional facade crumbled completely. "Please, Claire, I know Uncle Greg handled this all wrong. He's under a lot of pressure from the board. But we really need your help. If we lose Norton—" I felt a twinge of sympathy, not for Greg, but for the other employees who might suffer if Pinnacle lost its biggest client. People like Marlene, who'd been kind to me. People in accounting and IT who'd always treated me with respect. "I'll send instructions for accessing the Norton campaign files," I said finally. "But that's it. If Greg wants more, he can contact me directly. And my rate stands." Relief washed over Heather's face. "Thank you. Really." After she left, I sat down at my computer and typed out detailed instructions for accessing the Norton campaign materials. Clear, professional, comprehensive, just as I'd always been. I sent the email to Heather, copying Marlene and the creative team. Then I closed my laptop and went for another walk along the river. The afternoon sun sparkled on the water. A street musician played saxophone near the Michigan Avenue Bridge, the notes floating up between the skyscrapers. I dropped a 20 in his case and stood listening for a while, feeling the music vibrate in my chest. My phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. "You saved the day. Again. But you should know. Greg's furious that you're demanding consultant rates. Said some pretty awful things in the meeting." I typed back, "I'm not surprised, but I'm not afraid of him anymore." And as I sent those words, I realized they were true. The hold Greg had over me for 7 years, the fear of disappointing him, of losing my job, of not being good enough, had vanished the moment he called me worthless in front of everyone. There was a strange power in having nothing left to lose. The next 2 days passed in a blur of job applications, phone interviews, and long walks around Chicago neighborhoods I'd never had time to explore despite living here for years. My phone continued to buzz with desperate messages from Pinnacle employees, each one revealing another system or process that was mysteriously broken without me there. I responded selectively, providing basic guidance to the people who had always treated me with respect, ignoring the rest. Not once did I hear directly from Greg. On Friday morning, I had my first promising job interview, a startup looking for an operations director. The salary they mentioned was nearly double what I'd been making at Pinnacle. The interviewer, a woman about my age named Diane, seemed genuinely impressed by my experience. "You built all these systems yourself?" she asked, scrolling through my updated resume. "Yes," I said, and for once I didn't downplay my accomplishments. I designed them, implemented them, and maintained them for 7 years. "And Pinnacle let you go?" She looked genuinely confused. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about my dramatic exit. "Leadership changes," I said diplomatically. "New directions." Diane nodded, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. "Well, their loss would definitely be our gain." I'd like you to meet our CEO next week if you're available. As I left the interview, walking down Michigan Avenue in the spring sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in years. There was life after Pinnacle. Good life, potentially. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me press the green button. Claire Bennett speaking. Claire. Greg's voice, tight with forced pleasantness. How are you? My heart rate picked up, but I kept my voice steady. I'm well, Greg. What can I do for you? I think we got off on the wrong foot the other day. He spoke as if discussing a minor disagreement, not a public humiliation. Things were said in the heat of the moment. Corporate restructuring is always challenging. I waited, saying nothing, forcing him to fill the silence. The fact is, Claire, we've been experiencing some operational difficulties since your departure. Nothing major, just a few systems that need fine-tuning. I was hoping we could discuss your returning to help with the transition. I stopped walking, standing still in the middle of the sidewalk as people flowed around me. Returning as what exactly? Well, as a consultant, initially. Just until we get everything stabilized. Heather mentioned you had proposed a rate, which we can certainly discuss. My rate isn't negotiable, I interrupted. $200 an hour, 4-hour minimum, payment up front. A pause. I could almost hear his teeth grinding. That seems excessive for someone with your qualifications. The old Claire would have backed down, agreed to less, been grateful for the opportunity. The new Claire felt a surge of cold anger. My qualifications? I repeated. You mean the qualifications that built every operational system your company currently relies on? The ones that are now failing because no one else understands how they work? Those qualifications? Now, Claire. No, Greg. You called me a parasite in front of the entire company. You said my position was obsolete. You questioned what I even did there. And now that you're finding out exactly what I did, you want me to come back and fix your mess at a discount. Another pause. Longer this time. When Greg spoke again, his voice had lost its fake friendliness. Look, I made a mistake, all right? I didn't have the full picture. But the Norton campaign launches Monday, and we still can't access half the materials. The board is breathing down my neck. I need your help. There it was. The real reason for his call. Not an apology, not recognition of my value, just desperation because his job was on the line. I'll email you my consulting agreement, I said. Once payment is processed, I'll provide complete documentation for the Norton campaign and the vendor management system. That's all. That's not enough, Greg snapped. We need you in the office. There are dozens of systems. Then I suggest you start looking for my replacement. Someone with a master's degree, perhaps? Since my community college education was so inadequate. The words hung between us. I'd never thrown his elitist comments back at him before. This isn't like you, Claire, he said finally. You've always been a team player. No, Greg, I've always been taken advantage of. There's a difference. I took a deep breath. I'll send the agreement within the hour. The choice is yours. I ended the call before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly. Standing up to Greg after 7 years of deference felt both terrifying and exhilarating. True to my word, I emailed him a formal consulting agreement when I got home. Professional, thorough, with clear terms and deliverables. Just like everything I'd ever done for Pinnacle. I didn't expect him to sign it. Greg's ego was too large, his respect for me too small. He'd find another way, even if it meant throwing money at the problem, hiring an outside firm perhaps, or bribing someone from IT to hack into the secured systems. So I was surprised when, 3 hours later, I received a notification from my bank. A deposit from Pinnacle Solutions. $800. The agreed-upon 4-hour minimum. Minutes later, an email from Greg. Agreement signed. Documentation needed ASAP. No please. No thank you. Just demands, as always. I spent the rest of the afternoon compiling comprehensive documentation for the Norton campaign and the vendor management system. Step-by-step instructions, screenshots, passwords, workarounds for known issues. Everything a competent team would need to function without me. I was thorough not for Greg's sake, but for people like Marlene and Jaden who would be left to implement these processes. I sent the documentation at exactly the 4-hour mark, then closed my laptop. Agreement fulfilled. My phone rang almost immediately. Greg again. This is detailed, he said, sounding surprised. But there are still questions. The team needs you to walk them through the implementation. That would require additional consulting hours, I replied. A long pause. Fine. Another 4 hours. Monday morning. I'll be available by video conference only, I said. 9 to 1. Video won't work. We need you here, in person. That's not possible. In truth, I couldn't face the idea of walking back into that office, seeing the same people who had watched my humiliation in silence. Claire? Greg's voice dropped lower, almost threatening. Don't push me on this. The board is involved now. Your reputation in this industry depends on how you handle this transition. Was he threatening to blacklist me? The thought should have terrified me, but instead it only fueled my resolve. My reputation? I laughed softly. Greg, I've spent the last week updating my LinkedIn profile with detailed descriptions of all the systems I built at Pinnacle. Systems you're now realizing you can't function without. I've received calls from 3 recruiters and had an interview this morning for a director-level position. I'm not concerned about my reputation. Silence on the other end. I'll be available by video conference on Monday, 9 to 1, I repeated. Take it or leave it. Monday morning, he finally agreed, his voice tight. But this conversation isn't over. As I ended the call, I wondered what he meant by that. Was it another threat? Or was Greg Whitmore, for the first time in our 7-year relationship, beginning to realize he wasn't holding all the cards? Either way, I was no longer the same Claire Bennett who had walked meekly out of that conference room. I was someone new. Someone who understood her own value and wasn't afraid to claim it. What I didn't know was that Monday would bring much more than a video consultation. It would bring a confrontation that would change everything. The weekend passed quietly. I declined 3 more urgent calls from Pinnacle employees, including one from the CFO himself. My agreement was with Greg, and my documentation was comprehensive. If they couldn't figure it out, that wasn't my problem anymore. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I relaxed. Truly relaxed, without the constant hum of work anxiety in the background. I visited the Art Institute on Saturday, wandering through galleries I'd always meant to explore but never found time for. On Sunday, I met an old college friend for brunch, someone I'd lost touch with as Pinnacle gradually consumed my life. You look different, she said, studying my face across the table. More present. I smiled. I feel different. Monday morning arrived with a sense of both dread and determination. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and prepared for 4 hours of virtual hand-holding. At exactly 9 a.m., I logged into the video conference. 5 faces appeared on my screen. Greg, looking irritated. Heather, nervously twisting her hair. Jaden from IT, his expression unreadable. The new finance director, whose name I couldn't remember. And surprisingly, Marlene. Good morning, I said, my voice calm and professional. Let's not waste time, Greg replied. We have the Norton campaign launching in less than 4 hours, and we're still having issues implementing your instructions. I noted his hesitation, the way he almost choked on acknowledging that he needed my help. What specific issues are you encountering? Jaden spoke up. The access protocols for the media assets require 2-factor authentication, but the registered phone number is yours, Claire. Of course it was. I'd set up that security system myself after a competitor tried to hack our client database last year. Greg had dismissed my concerns at the time, but grudgingly allowed the enhanced security measures as long as they didn't slow anything down. I can temporarily authorize a bypass, I said, but you'll want to register a new admin number immediately. I'm sending the override code now. I typed it into the chat box, then walked them through the process. One by one, we addressed the issues. They were facing missing passwords, authorization sequences, verification processes. Each problem revealed another system I had built, secured, and maintained without recognition. The finance director, Davis, I finally remembered, seemed increasingly impressed. You designed all this yourself? He asked during a brief pause. Yes, I said simply, without additional compensation or title. Adjustment? He pressed, glancing at Greg, whose face had turned an interesting shade of red. That's not relevant to our current task. Greg interrupted quickly. Claire, the vendor payment system is still locked. We have 3 urgent invoices pending. I guided them through that process as well, all the while aware of the growing tension. Davis kept giving Greg significant looks. Marlene was taking copious notes. Heather looked increasingly uncomfortable. By noon, we had resolved most of the critical issues. The Norton campaign was ready to launch, the vendor payments were processing, and the basic operational systems were functioning again. I believe that covers everything in our agreement, I said, preparing to end the call. Actually, Davis said, I have a few more questions about the financial reconciliation system. The automated reports aren't generating correctly. Greg cut in. That's outside the scope of our current agreement. Claire has fulfilled her contracted hours. I raised an eyebrow. I'm happy to continue at my standard rate if that's what you're asking. Absolutely, and Greg began. Yes, Davis interrupted firmly. The board has authorized additional consulting hours as needed to stabilize all critical systems. I saw Greg's jaw tighten, but he remained silent. Interesting. The board was clearly taking a more active role than I'd realized. In that case, I said, I'll need a formal extension of our agreement. Same terms, additional hours. I'll send it over immediately, Davis replied, ignoring Greg's glare. We continued for another hour, addressing the financial systems. Throughout, I maintained a professional demeanor, never mentioning the way I'd been fired, never showing the anger I still felt. But with each system we discussed, each problem I solved, the reality of what Greg had done became increasingly obvious to everyone on the call. At 1:15, as we were wrapping up, Davis asked the question that had been hovering unspoken throughout the morning. Claire, would you consider returning to Pinnacle in a more permanent capacity? Perhaps as operations director? The question hung in the air. Greg's face froze in a mask of barely controlled rage. Heather looked down at her hands. Jaden and Marlene both watched me intently. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I'm exploring other opportunities at the moment. Of course, Davis nodded. But if you change your mind, the door is open. Your expertise is clearly invaluable to this company. The word choice wasn't lost on anyone. Invaluable. Not parasitic. Not obsolete. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, processing what had just happened. The validation felt good. I couldn't deny that. But it also came too late. Where was this recognition when I'd been working 60-hour weeks for years? Where was this appreciation when I'd asked for raises, for promotions, for the most basic acknowledgement of my contributions? My phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. That was amazing. Davis has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. Word is they're discussing Greg's leadership. I stared at the message, unsure how to feel. I hadn't set out for revenge, hadn't intended to undermine Greg's position. I'd simply stood up for myself, demanded fair compensation for my expertise, and stopped hiding the extent of my contributions. Was that enough? Should it be enough? Before I could reply to Marlene, another call came through. Diane from the startup I'd interviewed with on Friday. Claire, great news. Our CEO was extremely impressed with your resume and wants to meet with you tomorrow. The position we discussed, we're actually considering upgrading it to VP of Operations based on your experience. Would that interest you? VP of Operations. A title that reflected my actual skills and responsibilities. A salary that matched my worth. A fresh start. Yes, I said. That would interest me very much. After we, scheduled the meeting, I finally replied to Marlene. Thanks for letting me know, but whatever happens with Greg isn't my concern anymore. I'm moving forward, and I meant it, or at least I thought I did. Until Sunday afternoon, 6 days after I'd been publicly fired, when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, I saw Greg Whitmore, still in his Sunday golf clothes, looking shaken and desperate. For a moment, I considered not answering. What more could we possibly have to say to each other? But curiosity won out. I opened the door but remained firmly in the doorway, not inviting him in. Greg, I said, my voice neutral. This is unexpected. He looked terrible. Eyes bloodshot, hair disheveled, the confident posture gone. Claire, he said, his voice hoarse. We need to talk. About? Everything's falling apart. He ran a hand through his hair. The Norton campaign launched, but there are issues with the analytics tracking. The board is asking questions I can't answer. Davis is reviewing all our operational protocols, and now I hear you're interviewing with Byteforge. He named the startup I'd been talking with. I said nothing, waiting. Look, he continued, desperation creeping into his voice. I know I handled things badly. I was under pressure from the board to cut costs, and I made a mistake, but I'm offering you your job back. Full reinstatement, 10% raise, director title. The offer hung in the air between us. A week ago, it might have seemed generous. Now, it was almost insulting. That's not going to happen, Greg. His facade of contrition cracked. What do you want then? More money? A bigger title? You can't just leave us hanging like this. The systems you built, they're too complex. No one else understands them. That's not my problem anymore, I said calmly. I provided comprehensive documentation. I fulfilled my consulting agreement. Our business relationship is concluded. Be reasonable, Claire. His, voice rose. You know how important this is. The company could what? I interrupted. Struggle? Fail? And whose fault would that be, Greg? The person who built the systems that kept everything running, or the person who fired her without understanding what she actually did? He stared at me, speechless for perhaps the first time since I'd known him. You called me a parasite, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion building inside me. In front of everyone, after 7 years of loyalty, of solving your problems, of making you look good, you questioned what I even did at the company. Well, now you know. I apologized for that, he said, though we both knew he hadn't. No, Greg. You offered me my job back because you're in trouble. That's not an apology, it's desperation. His expression hardened. So this is revenge. You're enjoying watching us struggle. This isn't revenge, I said. This is consequence. You made a decision based on arrogance and ignorance, and now you're living with the result. I've moved on. To Byteforge? He scoffed. That startup won't last 6 months. Maybe not. But they recognized my value immediately, which is more than you did in 7 years. We stood in silence for a moment, the gulf between us unbridgeable. Tell me, I said finally, curiosity getting the better of me. Why did you really fire me? Was it just cost-cutting, or was there more to it? Greg looked away, unwilling or unable to meet my eyes. The board wanted operational streamlining. Your position seemed redundant. Redundant, I repeated. Because you didn't understand what I actually did. I knew you handled operations, he said defensively. I just didn't realize the extent. You didn't want to know, I corrected him. Because if you acknowledged how much I was doing, you'd have had to pay me accordingly. Give me the appropriate title. Recognize my contributions. He didn't deny it. Goodbye, Greg, I said, starting to close the door. I wish you luck finding someone to replace me. I suggest offering a competitive salary and showing them the respect they deserve. Claire, wait. His voice was desperate now. Just tell me the master password for the system architecture. Please. The board meeting is tomorrow morning, and if I can't answer their questions, you can name your price, I said, echoing his words from our final confrontation in the conference room. Consider yourself cut off. I closed the door on his stunned face, turned the lock, and leaned against it, heart pounding. For the first time in 7 years, I felt truly, completely free. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee, and sat by my window watching the city come to life. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind that makes Chicago feel like the most vibrant place on earth after the long gray winter. My interview with Byteforge was scheduled for 10 a.m. I'd selected a professional but confident outfit. A tailored blazer over a silk blouse, not the muted, blend-into-the-background attire I'd worn at Pinnacle. As I was about to leave, my phone rang. Marlene. Claire, have you seen the news? What news? Check your email. Now. I opened my laptop and found an email from Marlene with the subject line, Board Announcement. Attached was an internal memo that had apparently been sent to all Pinnacle employees that morning. After careful consideration, the board of directors announces the immediate departure of Gregory Whitmore as CEO of Pinnacle Solutions. Davis Henderson will serve as interim CEO while the board conducts a thorough search for permanent leadership. This transition comes as part of a larger operational restructuring aimed at strengthening our core systems and ensuring the continued excellence our clients expect. We thank Mr. Whitmore for his years of service and wish him well in his future endeavors. All employees will receive further information about this transition in departmental meetings, scheduled throughout the day. I read it twice, letting the implications sink in. Greg was gone. After 7 years of unchecked authority, of taking credit for others' work, of building his career on the backs of people like me, he had finally faced consequences. Claire, are you there? Marlene's voice came through the phone I'd almost forgotten I was holding. Yes, I'm here. I'm just processing. It was incredible, she said, her voice hushed but excited. The board meeting this morning. Davis presented a comprehensive analysis of all the systems you'd built and maintained. Showed how Greg had repeatedly taken credit for your innovations while systematically underpaying you. Revealed that most of our client retention could be directly attributed to your work. I sat down, my legs suddenly unsteady. How do you know all this? I was there, Marlene said. Davis asked me to compile data on the operational improvements over the past 5 years. When I started digging, well, your fingerprints were on everything. every efficiency gain, every cost-saving measure, every client retention strategy. It was all you, Claire. A complex mix of emotions washed over. Me, vindication, certainly, but also a lingering sadness for all the years I dimmed my own light, made myself smaller, accepted less than I deserved. There's more, Marlene continued. Davis wants to talk to you. Not about consulting this time. He mentioned something about a new position. Chief Operations Officer. COO. The title I'd secretly dreamed of but never thought possible with my background, my education, my habitual invisibility. I have an interview with Byteforge in an hour, I said, my thoughts swirling. Take the interview, Marlene advised. But maybe don't make any decisions until you've heard what Davis has to offer. A lot has changed here in the past week, Claire. After we hung up, I sat motionless, trying to process everything. Greg was gone. The systems I'd built were finally being recognized for their value. A C-suite position was potentially on the table. It was everything I should have wanted. So why did I feel so conflicted? The answer came slowly as I walked to my Byteforge interview, the spring breeze clearing my head. This wasn't about Pinnacle anymore. It wasn't about Greg or recognition or even vindication. It was about me, what I wanted, what I valued, what kind of future I was building. For 7 years, I'd defined myself by that job, by being the person who solved problems, who made things work, who never complained. I'd measured my worth by my usefulness to others, particularly to people who didn't appreciate me. Did I want to go back to that environment, even with a new title and Greg gone? Or was this my chance to truly start fresh? The Byteforge offices couldn't have been more different from Pinnacle's corporate glass tower. Housed in a converted industrial space in the West Loop, the startup had an energy that was palpable from the moment I stepped through the door. Creative, collaborative, alive with possibility. Diane greeted me warmly and introduced me to Raj Patel, the founder and CEO. Unlike Greg, who always, maintained a careful distance from his employees, Raj had an open desk in the main workspace. He spoke with genuine passion about the company's mission, creating software that made operations more transparent and accessible for small businesses. The problem with most enterprise systems, he explained, is that they're designed by people who've never actually had to use them day to day. We're building something different, tools that empower rather than obstruct. As he outlined his vision for the VP of Operations role, I found myself nodding along, ideas already forming. This was the kind of environment where my skills could truly flourish, where innovation was valued over hierarchy, where contribution mattered more than credentials. Your experience at Pinnacle is impressive, Raji said, but what really caught my attention was how you described rebuilding their vendor management system to work around the limitations of the basic package. That's exactly the kind of practical problem-solving we need here. By the end of the interview, they had offered me the position, VP of Operations with a salary nearly triple what I'd been making at Pinnacle, plus equity in the company. We're still small, Diane explained, but we're growing fast. You'd be building your team from the ground up? Building something from the ground up. Creating rather than just maintaining. Leading rather than following. The possibility was exhilarating. Can I have a day to consider? I asked. Of course, Raj nodded. We understand you may have other options to weigh. As I left the Byteforge offices, my phone buzzed with a text from Davis. When can we meet to discuss your future at Pinnacle? I stood on the sidewalk, Chicago's skyline stretching before me, at a crossroads both literal and figurative. Return to Pinnacle with the title and recognition I'd always deserved, or leap into something entirely new with Byteforge? The answer came with surprising clarity. Neither option was about proving anything to anyone else anymore. This decision was mine alone, based on what I truly wanted for my future. I texted Davis back. Let's meet tomorrow morning. I'd like to hear what you're proposing. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, my doorbell rang again. For a moment, I feared it might be Greg, back with more desperate pleas or accusations. Instead, I found Jaden from IT, looking uncomfortable but determined. Sorry to just show up, he said, his usual taciturn manner intact. But I wanted to give you this in person. He handed me a flash drive. What is it? I asked. Evidence, he said simply. Emails, calendar entries, meeting recordings, showing how Greg systematically took credit for your work while blocking your advancement. I've been collecting it for years. I stared at him, speechless. You always helped me when no one else would, he continued, not quite meeting my eyes. When I started at Pinnacle, I could barely talk to anyone because of my anxiety. You were the only one who didn't treat me like I was broken. You created systems that let me do my job without having to navigate office politics. I hadn't realized he'd noticed. Why give this to me now? I asked. Because you deserve to know that some of us saw what was happening, and because he hesitated. Because I already gave copies to Davis and the board. It was part of why they fired Greg. The realization struck me. Jaden, the quietest person at Pinnacle, had been my silent advocate. While I'd been building systems, he'd been building a case. Thank you, I said, genuinely moved. This means a lot. He nodded once, awkwardly, then turned to leave. Whatever you decide about coming back, he said over his shoulder. Some of us miss you, but we all want you to do what's best for you. For once. As I closed the door behind him, I felt a shift in my perspective. I'd been so focused on the ways I'd been unseen, unappreciated, undervalued, that I'd missed the people who had noticed, who had valued my contributions, who had been silently in my corner all along. I slept fitfully that night, my dreams a confused tangle of conference rooms and code, of closed doors and new possibilities. By morning, I still wasn't certain what I would say to Davis, what path I would choose. But I knew that whatever decision I made would be from a position of strength, not desperation, of choice, not necessity. For the first time in my professional life, I had options, real options, and the freedom to choose what was truly best for me. As I prepared for my meeting with Davis, selecting another confident outfit, I realized something important. Regardless of where I worked next, I would never again make myself small to make someone else feel big. I would never again hide my light to avoid outshining an insecure boss. I would never again accept less than I was worth. The Claire Bennett who had walked meekly out of that conference room a week ago was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood her value and wasn't afraid to claim it. The Pinnacle Solutions offices looked exactly the same as they had a week ago, yet everything felt different as I stepped off the elevator. The receptionist did a double take, her professional smile faltering for a moment before she recovered. Ms. Bennett, welcome back. Mr. Henderson is expecting you. As she buzzed me through, I noticed employees watching me from their desks, some offering tentative smiles, others quickly looking away. News traveled fast in corporate environments, and my situation was undoubtedly the most interesting gossip Pinnacle had seen in years. Davis Henderson met me at his office door, Greg's former office, I noted. Unlike Greg, who had cultivated an aura of inaccessibility behind his massive mahogany desk, Davis had rearranged the space with a round conference table near the window. Claire, thank you for coming, he said, extending his hand. Please, have a seat. Xiao. View of Chicago from the 42nd floor was spectacular, the morning sun glinting off Lake Michigan in the distance. I'd rarely been invited into this office during my 7 years at Pinnacle. When I had, it was usually to quietly fix something Greg had broken. I imagine you've heard about the changes here, Davis began, sitting across from me. Some of them, I replied neutrally. Davis nodded. The board's decision regarding Greg wasn't made lightly, but it was necessary. His management approach had created significant vulnerabilities in our operational infrastructure, vulnerabilities that became apparent only after your departure. I appreciated his diplomatic phrasing, though we both knew the truth was less polite. Greg had been fired because he'd fired me without understanding what I actually did. Which brings me to why I asked you here today, Davis continued. We're restructuring our executive leadership team, creating a new position that will report directly to me, Chief Operations Officer. The role would encompass everything you were already managing, but with the appropriate title, authority, and compensation. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a formal offer letter outlining the position, responsibilities, reporting structure, and a salary figure that made my eyebrows rise involuntarily. It was more than even Byteforge had offered, with additional stock options and benefits. This isn't charity or guilt, Davis said, reading my expression. It's recognition of your value to this company. The board has reviewed your contributions extensively. Frankly, we're embarrassed it took losing you to realize what you've built here. I studied the offer letter, taking my time. The position was everything I should have had years ago. Executive leadership, a seat at the decision-making table, the authority to implement systems properly rather than through workarounds and back channels. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I need to know something first. Why didn't anyone speak up when Greg fired me? You were in that meeting, Davis. Everyone was. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's a fair question. For what it's worth, I did raise concerns with the board immediately afterward, but in the moment, he sighed. In the moment I failed. We all did. Corporate culture can create a kind of bystander effect. Everyone assumes someone else will speak up, and in the end, no one does. I nodded, understanding all too well. I'd been guilty of the same silence many times, watching others receive unfair treatment while saying nothing. The culture here needs to change, Davis continued. That's part of why we want you back. Not just for your technical expertise, but to help build a more transparent, equitable environment. Your experience gives you a unique perspective on what needs to change. The offer was tempting. A chance to return not as the invisible problem solver, but as a recognized leader with real power to make changes. To transform the very place that had once diminished me. I have another offer, I said. From ByteForge, VP of Operations. Davis nodded, unsurprised. We expected as much. They're doing interesting work. Yes, they are. I closed the folder, gathering my thoughts. I'd like some time to consider both options. Of course, Davis agreed. Take all the time you need. But before you go, there's someone else who'd like to speak with you, if you're willing. I raised an eyebrow questioningly. The team, he explained. They've asked for a few minutes. Curious. I agreed. Davis led me to the main conference room, the same one where Greg had humiliated me a week ago. When he opened the door, I was stunned to find it filled with people. Not just a few team members, but nearly the entire operations department, IT, several people from marketing, even some of the client services team. Marlene stepped forward from the group, looking nervous but determined. We wanted to say something that should have been said last week, she began. When Greg made his announcement, we all sat there in shock. No one knew it was coming. No one agreed with it. And no one had the courage to speak up in that moment. Jaden stepped up beside her. After you left, everything fell apart. Not just the systems, but the team. We realized how much you'd been holding everything together. Not just the technical stuff, but us. You were the one who made this place work. One by one, others shared similar sentiments. How I'd quietly helped them learn processes, solved problems without taking credit, created systems that made their jobs possible. Some apologized for not speaking up. Others simply expressed gratitude. As I listened, something shifted inside me. The anger and hurt I'd been carrying began to transform into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. These people hadn't failed me out of malice. They'd been caught in the same toxic system I had, afraid to risk their own security by challenging authority. When they finished, the room fell silent, waiting for my response. Thank you, I said simply. That means more than you know. After saying goodbye, promising to consider the offer and be in touch soon, I left the Pinnacle building and walked to a small park nearby. I needed space to think, away from both Pinnacle's familiar environment and ByteForge's exciting energy. The park was peaceful, spring flowers beginning to bloom along the pathways. I sat on a bench, weighing my options. Pinnacle offered vindication, a chance to return triumphantly to the place that had undervalued me, now with the recognition and authority I deserved. It would be satisfying to walk those halls as COO, to implement changes I'd advocated for years, to build something better from within. ByteForge offered a fresh start, an opportunity to help build something from the ground up in an environment that already valued innovation and transparency. No history to overcome, no painful memories attached to the hallways and conference rooms. Both were good options. Both recognized my worth. The choice wasn't about which offered more money or prestige. It was about which path would lead to the future I truly wanted. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I heard you're considering returning to Pinnacle. For what it's worth, you deserve better than having to rebuild what others broke. Greg. Somehow he'd heard about the offer. His message wasn't an apology, of course not, but there was an element of truth in it. Did I want to spend my energy fixing what had been broken at Pinnacle, or building something entirely new? I thought about my mother, about what she would say in this moment. She'd always believed I was meant for more than I allowed myself to reach for. You're the smartest one in the room, Claire, she'd say. Don't let anyone make you forget that. For years, I'd let people make me forget. I dimmed my light, accepted less than I deserved, made myself smaller to avoid threatening fragile egos. Not anymore. The choice, when it finally crystallized, felt right in a way I couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't about running away from Pinnacle or running toward Byteforge. It was about choosing the future that aligned with who I was becoming, not who I had been. I pulled out my phone and made 2 calls, first to Davis, then to Raj at Byteforge. By the time I left the park, my path was clear. That evening, I wrote 2 emails. The first was to the Pinnacle team, thanking them for their support and explaining my decision. The second was to Greg, brief but carefully worded. You once called me a parasite. The truth is, I gave that company everything I had for 7 years. My time, my ideas, my dedication. I built systems that will continue to serve Pinnacle long after both of us are gone. There's power in that kind of quiet contribution, even when it goes unrecognized. I don't need your acknowledgement anymore, but I hope you've learned that the people doing the invisible work are often the ones holding everything together. Good luck with your future endeavors. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't get one, but sending it felt like closing a chapter, releasing the last remnants of resentment I'd been carrying. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose and possibility I hadn't felt in years. The path ahead was clear now, illuminated by a newfound understanding of my own worth and the courage to claim it. Whatever came next, I would face it not as the invisible problem solver, but as the architect of my own future, visible, valued, and unapologetically claiming my space in the world. 3 months can change everything. On a warm, summer morning, I stood in Byteforge's new offices, a spacious loft in Chicago's Fulton Market district with windows that flooded the space with natural light. As VP of Operations, I'd helped oversee the move, designing workflows and systems for our rapidly expanding team. Byteforge had secured a major round of funding shortly after I joined, accelerating our growth beyond even Raj's optimistic projections. My experience building complex operational infrastructures proved invaluable as we scaled, but this time my contributions were visible, celebrated, properly compensated. The client demo is ready when you are, Diane called from across the open workspace. Conference room A. I gathered my notes and headed to the meeting. Our newest product, an intuitive operations management system, designed specifically for small and mid-sized businesses, was launching next month. Today, we were previewing it for a select group of potential clients. As I entered the conference room, I stopped short. Sitting at the table among the other guests was a familiar face, Davis Henderson. He nodded in greeting, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Claire, good to see you. Davis, I replied, recovering quickly. I wasn't expecting Pinnacle to be interested in our small business solutions. I'm not here representing Pinnacle, actually, he said. I've joined the board of Westbrook Industries. They're looking to overhaul their operational systems, and your name came up as someone developing innovative solutions in that space. I smiled, appreciating the irony. Westbrook had been one of Pinnacle's most challenging clients, demanding, constantly changing requirements, never quite satisfied with the solutions Greg proposed. I'd spent countless hours creating workarounds to meet their needs. Well, we're happy to show you what we've built, I said, moving to the front of the room to begin the presentation. The demo went flawlessly. Our product was elegant, intuitive, and addressed pain points I'd observed for years, but never had the authority to solve at Pinnacle. The clients asked thoughtful questions, clearly impressed by what they saw. Afterward, as the others filed out, Davis lingered. That was remarkable, Claire, he said. Truly innovative. I think Westbrook will be very interested. Thank you, I replied. How are things at Pinnacle? Stabilizing, he said. We hired a team of consultants to document and rebuild the systems you created. Cost a fortune, but worth it. And we finally implemented that operational transparency initiative you proposed 2 years ago. I nodded, genuinely glad to hear it. Despite everything, I didn't wish Pinnacle ill. Too many good people worked there. People who had eventually stood up for me when it mattered. And the COO position? I asked. Filled as of last month. Marlene Taylor. I couldn't hide my surprise. Marlene, but she's so young, inexperienced on paper? Davis smiled. She reminds me of someone else who joined Pinnacle with potential that wasn't immediately obvious. She's been extraordinary. Rebuilt the marketing analytics system from scratch. Improved client retention by 15%. Has a real talent for seeing how all the pieces fit together. Warmth spread through me at the news. Marlene had been one of the few who showed real kindness during my final days at Pinnacle. To hear she'd found her own path to leadership felt like a kind of poetic justice. I'm glad, I said sincerely. She deserves it. Davis nodded. Your decision not to return? It was the right one, wasn't it? I glanced around Byteforge's bright, collaborative space, thought about the team I was building, the culture we were creating together. Yes, I said. It was. Declining Pinnacle's generous offer hadn't been about rejecting vindication or forgiveness. It had been about recognizing that sometimes the bravest choice isn't returning to reclaim what was taken from you, but moving forward toward something better. I'd chosen Byteforge not because it was new or different, but because it aligned with the future I wanted to build, one where innovation was valued over hierarchy, where contribution mattered more than credentials, where leadership meant empowering others rather than diminishing them. Have you heard from Greg? I asked, curious despite myself. Davis shook his head. Not directly. Word is he's struggling to find another executive position. Turns out, when you build your career on taking credit for other people's work, it catches up with you eventually. I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a quiet recognition of consequences naturally unfolding. Greg's downfall hadn't been my doing. It had been the inevitable result of his own actions, revealed when the systems he'd never bothered to understand fell apart without me. After Davis left, I returned to my office, a small but bright space with a window overlooking the city. Unlike the sterile corporate decor of Pinnacle, my workspace here reflected my personality. Shelves lined with books on systems design and organizational psychology, plants thriving in the sunlight, a framed photo of my mother on the desk. My phone buzzed with a notification, an email from Jaden. We'd stayed in touch, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss tech innovations. He was still at Pinnacle but thriving under the new leadership, finally receiving recognition for his talents. Thought you might appreciate this, he'd written, attaching a link to a business journal article. The headline made me catch my breath. The Invisible. Architects. How overlooked operations experts build corporate success. The article profiled several operations professionals whose behind-the-scenes work had transformed their companies, including, to my surprise, me. It detailed my contributions at Pinnacle and my current role at Byteforge, positioning my story as an example of how organizations fail when they devalue operational expertise. Most surprising was a quote from Greg Whitmore himself. I made a catastrophic error in judgment. Claire Bennett wasn't expendable. She was the foundation everything else was built upon. By the time I recognized that, it was too late. I read the quote twice, unsure how to feel. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Public recognition of the value I'd brought to Pinnacle. The contributions that had gone unseen for so long. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Raj leaned in, his expression bright with excitement. Just got word. Westbrook wants to move forward. They're talking about implementing across all their subsidiaries. He grinned. Your system design was what sold them. Davis specifically mentioned how intuitive the vendor management component is. I smiled, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over me. This success wasn't happening in spite of my experience at Pinnacle, but because of it. Every challenge I'd faced there, every system I'd built without recognition, every workaround I'd created, all of it had prepared me for this moment. That's fantastic, I said. When do we start? They want to move quickly. I was thinking you could lead the implementation team. Raj paused. Unless that would be uncomfortable, given your history with Pinnacle and some of these clients. I considered this briefly, then shook my head. Not at all. Actually, I think it's perfect. Later that evening, as I walked home along the Chicago River, I reflected on the journey of the past 3 months. The path from that humiliating conference room moment to my current reality hadn't been straight or simple. It had required courage, self-advocacy, and the willingness to believe I deserved better, all qualities I'd possessed but had suppressed for years. My phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. Heard about the Byteforge contract with Westbrook. Congratulations. Dinner soon to celebrate both our new roles? I smiled and texted back an enthusiastic yes. Near my apartment, I passed the park bench where I'd sat 3 months ago, weighing my options and choosing my path forward. On impulse, I sat down again, watching the last rays of summer sunlight glint off the surrounding buildings. In that moment of quiet reflection, I realized something important. What had happened at Pinnacle, the humiliation, the undervaluation, the eventual recognition, wasn't the defining story of my professional life. It was just one chapter in a longer narrative that I was still writing. Greg had called me a parasite in that conference room, trying to diminish me in front of everyone. In doing so, he'd inadvertently set me free from the constraints of others' perceptions, from the habit of making myself smaller, from the belief that my worth depended on others. recognition. The true measure of my value had never been in titles or salaries or public acknowledgement. It had always been in the systems I built, the problems I solved, the difference I made, whether anyone noticed or not. But there was power in being seen, in claiming space, in refusing to be diminished. I'd learned that too. As the sun set over Chicago, I felt profound gratitude for the journey, not despite its painful parts, but because of them. Every step, even the most difficult, had led me here, to this moment of clarity, purpose, and self-possession. Tomorrow, I would return to Byteforge. I would lead the Westbrook implementation, build new systems, mentor my growing team. I would continue creating and contributing, not from the shadows, but from a place of recognized expertise and leadership. The conference room moment that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. Greg's cruelty had been the catalyst for my transformation, from the person who quietly held everything together to the person who boldly built something new. In the end, I wasn't defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had created despite it all. Not by one man's attempt to diminish me, but by my own decision to rise. The people who overlook you today may one day find themselves begging for your help, but by then, you'll have outgrown the need to prove anything to anyone. I had outgrown that need, and in doing so, I had finally become the architect of my own future, visible, valued, and unapologetically claiming my space in the world.